Muse for you, awesome websites without code.
Hey, what's up users? John with Muse for you, here to help you build awesome websites without code. And here are 5 things I wish I knew before getting started with Adobe Muse. So this video is for anyone who's just gotten into Adobe Muse, or if you're someone considering getting into Adobe Muse, here are 5 things I think you should know before getting started. So the topics we're going to cover are fixed width breakpoints and scroll effects, adding breakpoints before and after, web fonts versus system fonts, the page expansion option, and browser pinning and responsive pinning. So I'll go ahead and jump into the first topic here, which is fixed width breakpoints and scroll effects. If you're just getting into Adobe Muse and you've seen kind of like the earlier videos, or if you've seen my earlier videos, a lot of it has to do with scroll effects. And prior to early 2016, Adobe Muse was mostly known for scroll effects. It was a really big thing. You could make things move as the user scrolled down the page. And then right around early 2016, Adobe Muse introduced responsive design with the breakpoints bar, so you could add breakpoints and change the layout of your site across different breakpoints. The thing with the breakpoints though is that it disabled the scroll effects, and the only way to get the scroll effects back was to set the breakpoint to a fixed width breakpoint. So right up here we have the breakpoints bar. So when you first get into Muse, if you were thinking, hey, I'm going to go into Muse and add scroll effects, once you go to the scroll effects panel here to the right, the first thing you'll see, it says to enable scroll effects, your breakpoint must be fixed width. So to do that, it's quite simple. You just go to the breakpoints bar, you right click and uncheck fluid width. So here we see it says fluid width, just click there. And then if we right click again, we see that fluid width is not checked. And now this breakpoint is a fixed width breakpoint. So the only difference between a fluid width and a fixed width breakpoint is that the page will stop being responsive once it reaches the minimum width breakpoint here, and you can change the minimum width so that, you know, as the user resizes, once they reach this point, the page won't be responsive anymore. I could go more into fluid width versus fixed width, but I just want to talk more about the scroll effects option here. Okay, so here we have a fixed width breakpoint. So now the scroll effects are enabled. So if I go to the scroll effects panel, I can see I now have access to the scroll effects. So just as an example, I'll create a scroll effect. So now you can use it just like you were to use it prior to the new update in early 2016. So, you know, I can fill this rectangle with an image, and yeah, I'll add an image here, and let's scale to fill, and I'll center it here. Okay, so I have this image, and let's say I don't want this image to move. I can just go to the fill option right up here, go to scroll, select motion, and just set everything to 0. So that image won't move in the background. So I'll preview, and I might have to add a bit more scroll height to the page. But as we can see, that image stays fixed, and we have that interesting scroll effect there. So there we go. So scroll effects can be enabled by using a fixed width breakpoint. Just something to know if you're just getting into Adobe Muse, you'll want to make the breakpoint a fixed width breakpoint. And I can also use the scroll effects here. I have a lot of videos on scroll effects, so if you want to learn how to use scroll effects, just check out those videos, and I'll leave a few in the description area below as well. All right, so let's move on to number 2. So number 2 is adding breakpoints before and after. So for this, I'm actually going to hide this text here so I can demonstrate this a bit better. I'll change this back to fluid width. So one thing I recommend when working with Adobe Muse is whether you're starting from mobile first, which would be, you know, starting at a really low breakpoint. So let's say I were to start at the 320 breakpoint, or if you're starting at the largest breakpoint first, one thing I recommend is always design the entire site first on one breakpoint and then add your breakpoints after. That way your elements will look will be in a similar position as all the other breakpoints. And I'll show an example to better demonstrate this. So let's say I have 4 blocks here. I'll just create some rectangles and just add 4 here. So I'll copy and paste and paste and paste. All right, so I have 4 blocks here, and these blocks can represent any element on your website. And now if I add breakpoints, if I go to the breakpoints bar, right click, add breakpoint, and I add a few breakpoints, we'll notice that the elements stay in the same position on the y-axis. So like if I go to each of the breakpoints, you know, just think of like a line here, like they're all the same distance from each other is pretty much what I'm trying to say here. They're all the same distance across the board, and because this rectangle, the resize option is set to responsive width, they'll just change size and width. But let's say I want to add, you know, after I've created the breakpoints, I want to add more elements to a specific breakpoint or across the entire layout of all the breakpoints. Let's say I were to add 4 more blocks here. So I'm going to copy these 4 and just paste it on the lowest breakpoint here. Okay, so now if I go back to the 768 breakpoint, notice what happens to these elements. Those 4 rectangles that I've added, and let me change the color so it's a bit more visible. Okay, if I go to 768, we can see that those 4 rectangles, they're kind of really messed up on the 768 breakpoint. And that's because I added elements after I added the breakpoints. If I go to the 960, the same thing. These 4 elements, they look nice on the breakpoint that I added it on the smallest breakpoint, but on these breakpoints, it just gets messed up. So if you've started to work with Adobe Muse and have seen this, you know, that's just kind of one of those things where you want to design your site first on one breakpoint and then add breakpoints, and then you can remove or hide things in other breakpoints. It just makes designing a bit easier in Adobe Muse. So that's number 2. I'll go ahead and delete these breakpoints. So the one thing to take away from that is just create your entire site on one breakpoint, whether it's mobile first or if you're starting on your largest breakpoint. Mobile first is also called progressive enhancement, or if you're starting from the largest breakpoint, that's called graceful degradation, because you're just removing things as you go down breakpoints. Or if you're starting mobile first, you'll be adding things as you go up in breakpoints. All right, so that's number 2. So let me bring back the text here. And the third one, the next thing is web fonts versus system fonts. So this is something I've talked a lot about, and I'll just delete this guide here. So when you first open Adobe Muse and you start adding text, so I'll create some text here, and I'll just say this is some text, and I'll highlight it, and I'll go to the text panel right up here. So when you go to the text panel, you have web fonts, standard fonts, and system fonts. If you notice for system fonts, it says exports as image. So I always recommend using web fonts and not system fonts. System fonts, they do get exported as images, and search engines cannot read the text in an image. So it's not great for search engine optimization. So as an example, I'll select this font here. It's a system font. And you'll notice with the system font, there's this capital T and this image symbol. And I'll just make the font a little bit larger. So this is some text. And now if I preview, I'll show just as an example. So we have the text here. I can't highlight it. So here you'll notice I can highlight this text up here. This text here that says this is some text, it's an actual image. I can right click and inspect, and here we can see it's an image, and this is the image right here. So search engines cannot read that text that's in the image. You can add alternative text, and that might help a little bit, but it's a best practice to use web fonts instead of system fonts. So just as an example, I'll go ahead and change this font here to a web font. So I'll click the drop down, I'll select web fonts, and I have that same font here as a web font. So this April fat face, I'll click there and I'll set it to regular. And now when I preview, I can highlight this text because it's actual text within the site. If I right click and inspect, there we have the text. It's in the code of the site, so search engines can read the content. And if this content matches the title of your site and description, the search engines will see that, and you could rank better with the search engines. So just a quick tip there, always use web fonts and never use system fonts. And if there was a font that wasn't a web font, you could use a website like fontsquirrel.com to convert a font to a web font, and also font plop. And I have a few quick tips on that as well, and I'll leave a link in the description area below for those as well. So you can add web fonts. Adobe Muse has hundreds of web fonts that you can add by going to File, Add, Remove Web Fonts, and then you can choose Typekit fonts or Edge Web Fonts. Yeah, so Typekit, Edge Web Fonts, or self-hosted. If you did add self-hosted, you just add a .woff, a .eot, and a .svg. All right, so those are, that's web fonts versus system fonts. So, okay, looks good. So the next thing I wish I knew before getting started with Adobe Muse is the page expansion option. And the page expansion is actually these arrows up here, and this allows the page to expand beyond the largest breakpoint. So as an example, if I were to create two rectangles and put them next to each other, so I'll create a rectangle here, and I'll create another rectangle here. So just like that. And I'll change the color here. So let me choose a different color. Yeah, I'll choose that color there. Okay, so I have these two colors, and from the looks of it, it looks like these two rectangles are going to expand the width of the browser. But because the page expansion is set to only expand to the 960 breakpoint, these rectangles are going to stop once that 960 width is reached. So if I preview, we can see that those rectangles stop there. So just picture like an invisible line coming down here and here. That would be the 960 breakpoint. If I did want these rectangles to go all the way to the left and the right, I could make the page expand beyond the 960 breakpoint simply by making these arrows point outward. So you just click these arrows and they point outward, and now the page will expand beyond the 960 breakpoint. So I'll go ahead, File, Preview Page in Browser, and now those rectangles expand beyond the 960 breakpoint. No matter how wide or how small I make the browser, those rectangles expand beyond the 960 breakpoint, and the same with the text up here. If I didn't want the text to expand, I could just set the responsive option for the text to none instead of responsive width. So now the text won't change width, and those rectangles will just change width. So this kind of segues into the next topic, which is browser pinning and responsive pinning. So if we notice on this page, the text looks like it's in the center, but if we preview, it's not, it's to the left. And that's because we can pin things responsively relative to the center, to the left, or the right. So here with this text selected, if I go to the responsive pinning, we have the pinning options up here. This pinning here to the left, this is pinning to the browser, so you can pin in the upper left, upper middle, upper right, lower left, lower middle, or lower right. And here we have the responsive pinning, so you can pin relative to the left side of the browser, relative to the center, or relative to the right. So as you resize the browser, that element will stay relative to these three positions. So with this text, I want it to stay relative to the center of the browser as I resize. So if I preview and I resize the browser, we can see that that text is more in the center. Because this text is not responsive, once I get to the width of the text, we lose some of the text there. So if I did want to go with this layout, I'd just add a breakpoint to make sure that this text is visible on another breakpoint. All right, so let me go over this in a bit more detail. So let me delete these two elements, and I'll work with the pinning to the browser first. So this is an example. Let's say I have, this block right up here, and if I preview and I scroll down, we can see that block scrolls with the rest of the website. But if I select the block and I go to the pinning options and pin to the upper left, that block will stay in place. So we see I'm scrolling and that block stays in place. So I can pin it to the right. If I have it on the right, I would want to pin it to the upper right. And I'll preview. I scroll, that block stays in place. And I can also pin it to the bottom. So when I pin to the bottom, I want to bring it to the bottom of the page. and I can pin it to the bottom left. The same with the bottom middle. So now that element is in the bottom left, I can, if I want it in the middle, I'll place it in the middle and pin to the bottom middle. And there it is. I scroll, stays there, or the bottom right. So those are the pinning to the browser options. So it literally just pins the element to the browser so it doesn't scroll with the rest of the site. And no matter how large or small you make the browser, that element will always be pinned in that location within the browser. All right, so now let's move on to the responsive pinning. So responsive pinning is a bit interesting, and I'm gonna create a rectangle here just to showcase this a bit better. So I'll create a rectangle and I'll fill the rectangle. So with this rectangle here, let's go ahead and see how it looks. So if I go to File, Preview Page, and Browser, and I resize, this is what the rectangle is doing at the moment. Okay, but let's say I want this rectangle to stay this distance from the left of the browser. So for this, I'll use responsive pinning. So I'll pin to the left, and now we have this dotted line here. So this rectangle will always be this exact distance from the left side of the browser. So this dotted line here. So now if I preview, and I resize, the browser, we can see that this rectangle isn't moving from the left. That's because it's pinned relative to the left. So it'll just stay that distance from the left side, and because it's set to responsive width, it'll change size responsively there. And I'll draw a rectangle here just to showcase this a bit better. Right there, and I'll make it black. So just picture this black rectangle, that dotted line from the left, and I'll also set this to, for the resize option, I'll set it to none, so that rectangle doesn't change size, and I'll preview in the browser. All right, so let me scroll down here. So as we can see, this element isn't going past this black rectangle. So when you're using breakpoints, this is a really useful tool because you can have elements pinned relative to the left, to the right, or the center. So if I were to place this on the right, and let me pin this element to the right now, and I also want to pin this element to the right as well. So they're both relative to the right side of the browser. So now I'll preview, and both of these elements are relative to the right, and they respond to the browser accordingly from the right side of the browser. And same with the center, I can pin to the center, and if I preview, that element will respond relative to the center of the browser. So as you're working on your site, you might have instances where if you add breakpoints, your element won't be perfectly centered. You'll just want to use the responsive pinning option and pin the element to the center. You can pin elements relative to the center, so this element will, when the browser changes size, this element will stay relative to the center of the browser. So it's just a really useful tool when working with responsive design. You can pin elements relative to the left, center, or right, and working with the page expansion is quite useful as well, because you can have the page expand beyond the 960 breakpoint, and it really helps when seeing your website across larger screens. And then working with the responsive pinning options, you can have elements, for instance, just as another quick example, let's say I wanted this element to always stay relative to the left side. I could pin it to the left, and if I preview, that element will always stay relative to the left side. If the page expansion wasn't set, and I preview, we can see we have the space here to the left because the website is stopping at the 960 breakpoint. So just good to know, like let's say you have a large site, or you want your site to look really good on large screens, you can set the page expansion to point outward, and then pin this, elements to the left and elements to the right. So those elements will always stay relative to the left and the right side of the browser. So I'll pin this to the right, and there we go. So we'll do something like this. And no matter how large I make the browser width, those elements stay flush to the right and the left. So it's really useful when designing for larger screens and just for responsive design in general. All right, so I could go more over responsive pinning and browser pinning. I do have a 17-day course where I talk a lot about responsive pinning. So those are the 5 things I wish I knew before getting started with Adobe Muse. I touched upon each topic. Some I got a little bit more in depth, like number 5. But yeah, they're just good things to know if you're just getting into Adobe Muse. And one thing I will say about Adobe Muse is that it is good to know a little bit about web design and development, or do a bit of research before you start using Adobe Muse, because Adobe Muse is essentially code in the back end. Learning about code or about web development in general could be really helpful before getting into Adobe Muse. With that said, you don't need to do that, but it is a learning curve. There are things you need to know about as you start developing your website in Adobe Muse. So hopefully that was helpful. These are the 5 things I wish I knew. If I were a beginner in Adobe Muse, I would want to know these things because I feel they're really important when developing a website. If there's anything I missed, you can let me know in the comment section below. So that's it for this video tutorial. Again, I do this to help you build awesome websites without code. If you like this video tutorial, you can subscribe below. Also in the show more section below are links to other resources and links to musefreeshop.com. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video tutorial. Thank you.
Muse for you, awesome websites without code.